The phone rang at 3:47 in the afternoon, and a man's voice, cold, amused, utterly without mercy, told Margaret Lawson that her 11-year-old grandson was zip-tied in the trunk of a car and that if she called the police, they would mail her his fingers one at a time. He laughed while he said it. He had no idea who he was talking to. Before we continue, if you believe grandmothers can be the most dangerous people alive, hit subscribe and stay with me to the very end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and burnt sugar because Maggie Lawson had been baking snickerdoodles since 6 that morning. Humming an old hymn under her breath, flour dusted across the sleeve of her cardigan like powdered snow. It was a Tuesday. Nothing about Tuesdays in Tucson had ever meant anything before. "Grandma, I'm heading out," Noah's voice rang from the front hall, backpack straps snapping against his shoulders. "Do you have your inhaler?" Maggie called back, not even turning from the oven. "Yes." "Water bottle?" "Yes, Grandma." "And did you finish your math?" "Grandma." Noah appeared in the doorway, grinning, 11 years old and gap-toothed, and utterly unaware that he was the last good thing keeping a retired ghost tethered to the world of the living. "I love you. I'm walking to Tyler's. I'll be back by 4. "Straight there, straight back," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "No shortcuts through the wash." I know. "Noah." He paused at the door, exhaling the particular exhale that only 11-year-old boys can produce when a grandmother repeats herself for the 3rd time. "No shortcuts, I promise." The screen door banged shut behind him, and Maggie stood alone in her kitchen, listening to his sneakers pound down the porch steps, listening to the sound fade into the ordinary hush of a desert afternoon. She did not know, could not have known, that she was listening to the last few minutes of a life she had built brick by brick for 11 years, a life made of church potlucks and vegetable gardens and telescope lenses, a life built specifically to bury another woman so deep that even Maggie herself sometimes forgot she had ever existed. She went back to her cookies. At 3:15, she pulled the last tray from the oven, and the smell filled the whole house, warm and sweet and ordinary. And she thought about nothing more complicated than whether she had enough cinnamon left for Sunday's batch. At 3:20, she noticed something wrong in her own chest. Not pain, not illness. A pressure behind the sternum, a prickle at the base of the skull, a stillness in the air that her body recognized a full 20 minutes before her mind caught up. Old training, old boss instinct, the kind of feeling that once upon a time in another country under another name had meant get to cover now. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself old women got funny feelings, sometimes squashed her nerves or too much coffee. She wiped down the counter. She told herself a lot of things in those 20 minutes, and every single one of them was a lie she needed to survive. At 3:40, the house phone rang. Tyler's mother. "Hi, Maggie, is Noah still there? He left his cleats, and I wanted to swing by before practice." "He's not here," Maggie said, slowly setting down the dish towel. "He was walking to your place after school." A pause, a bad pause, the kind of pause that tells you everything before the words arrive. "He never came, Maggie." Tyler's mother's voice tightened, worry sharpening every syllable. "Tyler said he wasn't at school for last period pickup either. His teacher said he left early, said his grandmother sent a note." Maggie's hand found the edge of the counter and gripped it. "I didn't send a note." The line went silent, dead air thick with dread. "I have to go," Maggie said, and hung up before Tyler's mother could answer, before the other woman's fear could bleed into her own and slow her down. She was in her car in 90 seconds. She did not remember grabbing her keys. She did not remember backing out of the driveway. What she remembered later, piecing together fragments in the dark hours afterward, was turning onto the dirt access road that cut behind the elementary school, and the dry wash, the exact road Noah had promised never to take, and seeing lying in the red dust like something discarded by a careless hand, a small pair of glasses. Cracked clean across one lens. One earpiece snapped off entirely. Maggie Lawson, 66 years old, retired widow, church volunteer, keeper of tomatoes and rosemary, and one small boy's entire universe stepped out of her car onto that dirt road and made a sound that had not left her body in 11 years. A sound with no words in it, just grief and rage fusing together into something white-hot and ancient. She knelt. She picked up the glasses with both hands as though they were something sacred, as though the act of holding them gently might undo whatever had already happened. Her phone began to ring. Unknown number. She answered before the second ring finished. "Where is my grandson?" Mrs. Lawson, the voice on the other end was male unhurried, faintly accented the practiced calm of a man who had made this exact call many times before to many other terrified mothers and grandmothers and had never once lost his composure. Or should I say Margaret, or perhaps I should use the name that matters more to people like me. Maggie's whole body went still, stiller than stone. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. A pause savoring itself, drawing out the silence like a man enjoying an expensive meal. Your grandson is safe for now. He is frightened and he is asking for you, and he does not understand why nice men with guns took him out of a stranger's car and put him in a room with no windows. Would you like to know what happens next? If you touch him, I am touching him right now, the voice said pleasantly, almost gently. My hand is on his shoulder. He's shaking. Would you like me to put him on the phone so you can hear him shake? There was a fumbling sound, a rustle of fabric, and then Noah's voice, small and cracked and trying so hard to sound brave that it broke something inside Maggie that she had spent 11 years believing was unbreakable. Grandma! His voice trembled. Grandma, I'm scared. There's men. They took me. I don't know where I am. Noah! Maggie's voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. Steady the way it used to come out in rooms where steady was the only thing standing between life and death. Noah, listen to me. Listen to my voice. I need you to breathe. Can you do that for me? A shaky inhale on the other end, then another. Good boy. I'm coming for you. Do you hear me? I am coming. Grandma, I'm so scared. The phone was yanked away mid-sentence. Noah's voice cut off with a small, muffled cry of protest that made every muscle in Maggie's body lock into something feral, something no longer entirely human. Touching isn't it, the man said, amusement threading through his words like poison hidden in honey. Now, listen carefully because I will only explain this once. 14 years ago, an operation took place in the Zagros foothills. Files were taken, a ledger financial records connecting certain governments, certain cartels, certain very powerful men who prefer to remain unnamed. That ledger disappeared along with the woman who took it. We have spent a long time finding her. Maggie said nothing. Her mind was already working, cataloging every detail, the accent, the phrasing, the specific knowledge of an operation that had been sealed under a classification most people in Washington didn't even know existed. You have 72 hours, the man continued. Bring us the archive and the boy comes home to you unharmed. Call the police, contact any federal agency and attempt anything clever. And I promise you, Margaret, we will send Noah home to you one piece at a time. Do you understand? Oh, I understand, Maggie said. Her voice had dropped into a register she hadn't used in 11 years, flat, cold, absolutely without mercy. But you should understand something too. Oh, the amusement in his voice thickened, delighted by her defiance. And what is that grandmother? You didn't kidnap a helpless old woman's grandson, Maggie said quietly. You just told the desert ghost that her family's in danger, and I want you to think very carefully about what that means before this call ends. There was a beat of silence on the line, just long enough for Maggie to hear something shift in the man's breathing, the first faintest crack in his composure, a hairline fracture in all that practiced calm. That name, he said slowly, is a myth. Ask the men who trained me if it's a myth, Maggie said. Oh, wait, you can't. They're all dead. She hung up. For 3 full seconds, Margaret Lawson stood alone on a dirt road in the fading Arizona light, phone in one shaking hand, her grandson's broken glasses in the other, and let herself feel every ounce of terror clawing up her throat. Then she folded it, compressed it, buried it somewhere below the fear, the way she had been trained to bury everything below the fear. And when she straightened up again, the woman standing on that road was not the same woman who had baked cookies that morning. She drove home in silence, hands steady on the wheel, eyes scanning every vehicle, every intersection, every shadow with a discipline that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with survival. She did not cry. She did not call 911. She walked through her front door, locked it behind her, closed every blind in the house with quick, practiced hands, and went into her bedroom where she knelt in front of the antique wardrobe that had belonged to her late husband, Daniel. A good man, a patient man, a man who had known exactly 1/3 of who she truly was and loved her anyway, right up until the cancer took him 5 years ago. She pressed her palm flat against the back panel of the wardrobe, found the seam invisible to any eye but hers, and pushed. The panel clicked, slid sideways, revealed a compartment no wider than 2 feet built into the wall itself, a compartment she had installed with her own 2 hands the week she'd bought this house 11 years ago. Because some habits, some precautions, you never truly let go of, no matter how many casseroles you bring to church. Potlucks. Inside, a Glock 19 wrapped in oilcloth magazines loaded and taped in pairs. A satellite phone battery dead, but she'd fix that within the hour. $40,000 in expanded and untraceable. 3 passports under 3 names that hadn't existed since before Noah was born. A folding knife her mentor had given her in a country whose name she'd been ordered to forget. And underneath all of it, wrapped in oilcloth of its own, a single manila folder, edges yellowed, stamped with a classification that no longer technically existed because the agency that issued it had buried the entire operation so deep that officially it had never happened. Maggie's hands trembled as she lifted the folder out. Not from fear, from recognition. They found it, she thought. After all these years, they actually found it. She sat back on her heels on the bedroom floor, the folder in her lap, and for one unguarded moment, the past came roaring back so violently that the bedroom around her seemed to dissolve entirely. She remembered sand. She remembered the smell of diesel and gunpowder, and heat that could kill a man in 20 minutes flat if he wasn't careful. She remembered a farmhouse outside Ramadi with a false floor, and beneath it a ledger that documented something so ugly, so financially catastrophic to certain men in certain governments, that 6 people had died trying to stop her from walking out of that farmhouse alive. She remembered walking out anyway, blood that wasn't hers soaked into her sleeve. She remembered the name they gave her afterward, whispered in briefing rooms from Langley to London, a name earned in silence and blood. The Desert Ghost. She remembered the day she chose to disappear, not because she was afraid, because her daughter, her only child, Emily gone too young, gone in a car accident on a rain-slicked highway that still didn't feel real. Some mornings had left behind a baby boy who needed a grandmother, not a legend. Maggie had walked into a director's office, laid her weapon on his desk and said, "I'm done." And she had meant it. For 11 years, she had meant it with her whole heart. Now a man on a telephone had just informed her that the past did not care what she meant. Her phone buzzed. A text. No caller ID. Just a photograph. Noah, sitting on a dirt floor, wrist bound in front of him, a bruise blooming ugly and dark along his cheekbone, eyes red and swollen from crying, staring directly into the camera like he was staring at her, begging her without words to please come. Something in Margaret Lawson's chest didn't break. It ignited. Okay, she whispered to the empty room, to the folder in her lap, to the woman in the photograph who no longer existed except in moments exactly like this one. Okay, you want a ghost. She stood. She began to move fast, efficient, every motion economical, in a way that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who'd only ever seen her hosting bake sales. She stripped the cardigan off and pulled a dark, long-sleeved shirt from the wardrobe, one she hadn't worn in over a decade. She loaded the Glock hands, remembering the weight of it instantly. She checked the knife's edge against her thumb, felt it bite clean, and nodded once satisfied. Her phone rang again. This time it was a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 11 years, a name she'd saved under a fake contact label church committee, just in case anyone ever looked through her phone. She answered, "Frank," a gravelly voice older now, roughened by cigarettes and time. "Maggie, I got a flag on my old system 20 minutes ago. Somebody pulled a request on a sealed file, your file. I thought you were dead, or I thought you wanted me to think that." "What's happening?" "They took Noah," Maggie said, and for the first time since the phone call, her voice cracked just slightly, just enough. "Frank, they took my grandson." Silence on the line. "Then who?" "Cartel-linked broker, but it's bigger than cartel. He knew about the Zagrosop Frank. He knew about the ledger. That intel was buried 6 levels deep. Somebody sold it." "Jesus, Maggie. I need everything you can get me. Satellite coverage of Southern Arizona ranch properties acquired in the last 18 months, anything cash purchased, anything with a recent heavy equipment deliveries or unusual security infrastructure. I need it in 2 hours. 2 hours. Frank exhaled hard, and she could picture him exactly rubbing a hand over his tired face the way he always did when a problem was bigger than he wanted it to be. "Maggie, you've been out for 11 years. You sure you still—" "Frank!" Her voice cut through the line like a blade, sharp and final. "They have my grandson zip-tied to a chair with a bruise on his face. I don't care what I'm sure I still am. I care about getting him back, and I will walk through every man on that ranch to do it. Now, are you going to help me, or am I going to do this the hard way? A long pause, then quietly, almost reverently, I'll call you back in 90 minutes. The line went dead. Maggie sat down at her kitchen table, the same table where 12 hours earlier, she'd helped Noah with a diagram of Saturn's rings, his tongue poking out in concentration, his small hand gripping a pencil too tightly, and spread out a blank legal pad and began to write. Not a grocery list, not a church schedule, a plan, entry points, timeline windows, extraction routes. Her handwriting, once elegant and looping from decades of forged signatures and false identities, came back to her hand like it had never left at all. Her phone buzzed again. The kidnapper. Tick-tock, Margaret. 72 hours. Don't disappoint us. She typed back a single line, her thumb steady, even though her heart was a war drum in her chest. You have no idea what you just started. She set the phone down and for a moment allowed herself to look at the framed photograph on her kitchen wall. Noah, on his 8th birthday, gap-toothed, missing one front tooth, grinning up at a slice of chocolate cake like it was the greatest gift the universe had ever offered him. Beside it, a smaller photo, Emily, 26 years old, laughing at something just outside the frame. Forever, 26, forever laughing. Because that was the last photograph Maggie ever took of her daughter before the accident that ended one life and reshaped another. I already lost her, Maggie said quietly to the empty kitchen. I am not losing him too. Her phone buzzed a third time. Not the kidnapper, Frank. That was fast, Maggie said, snatching it up. I didn't call you back yet, Frank said, and something in his voice had changed, gone tighter. Harder, the voice of a man who had just seen something he wished he hadn't. Maggie, I started pulling threads before you even asked, because the second you said Zagros, I knew this was going to be bad. I found something, and you are not going to like it. Tell me. The purchase records on 3 ranch properties outside Tucson cash buys shell companies, all routed through the same law firm in Panama. I cross-referenced the shell company's registered agent. Frank paused, and in that pause, Maggie heard 11 years of buried history rushing back toward her like a flash flood tearing down a dry wash. Maggie, the name on the paperwork traces back to a man we both used to know. A man who was supposed to be disgraced and buried in a federal facility for the rest of his natural life. Maggie's blood went cold. Say the name Frank. Victor Kane. The room seemed to tilt beneath her. Victor Kane, her former handler. The man who had trained her, mentored her, sat across from her in 100 debriefing rooms and told her she was the finest asset the agency had ever produced, right up until the day he was quietly indicted for selling classified assets to the highest bidder, court-martialed in secret, and disappeared into a black facility that officially did not exist. The man who apparently did not stay disappeared. He's out, Maggie whispered. He's out, Frank confirmed grimly. And Maggie, if it's Kane running this, then this was never about a ledger. This was never random. He knows exactly who you are. He knows exactly what you're capable of. Which means this whole thing, the kidnapping, the countdown, all of it, was designed to draw me out. Maggie finished, her voice hollow. Designed to draw you into a trap, Frank said quietly. Maggie, listen to me. If it's Kane, you cannot go into this alone. He knows your training. He knows your tactics. He practically built the manual you learned from. Maggie stood up from the kitchen table, walked to the window, and looked out at the darkening desert beyond her yard, the same desert that had made her unmade her, and was now apparently about to test her one final time. Frank, she said softly, he taught me tactics. He didn't teach me love. He never understood the difference, and that's exactly why he's going to lose. She hung up the phone, walked back to the wardrobe, and lifted out the last item hidden in the false compartment, a small, battered compass that had once belonged to her own mentor, the man who trained her before Kane ever did, dead now for 15 years, but whose voice she could still hear clear as a bell in moments like this one. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes, Maggie, but it remembers its own. She closed her fist around the compass, felt its worn brass edges bite into her palm, and let that small pain ground her. Outside, the sun was beginning its long, bloody descent toward the mountains, painting the sky the color of a wound. Somewhere out there, in a ranch house behind fences and armed men and a countdown clock, her grandson was sitting in the dark, terrified, waiting for a grandmother who baked cookies and grew tomatoes. He had no idea that grandmother was already gone. In her place stood something the desert itself had built and buried, and tonight was about to release back into the world, patient, precise, and absolutely without mercy for any man foolish enough to touch her family. Margaret Lawson closed the wardrobe, shouldered a bag she hadn't packed in 11 years, and walked out her front door into the fading light. Behind her, the porch light flickered once and went dark. Ahead of her lay 72 hours, a ranch full of armed men, a traitor named Victor Kane, who believed age had made her weak, and a boy who needed her to prove one final time that some legends never actually retire. They only sleep. And Margaret, the desert ghost Lawson, had just woken up. Frank called back in 83 minutes, not 90, and Maggie had the satellite phone charged and sitting on the kitchen table before the first ring finished. "Talk to me," she said. "I've got 3 properties," Frank said, and she could hear keys clicking fast in the background, the sound of a man working faster than his body wanted to. "Cash purchases, shell companies, all 3, inside a 40-mile radius of where you found those glasses. 2 of them are nothing, vacant land, no structures, no utility hookups. But the third one, he paused. Maggie, the third one, had a water tank installed 11 days ago. Propane delivery 2 weeks before that. Someone's living there, and someone's been living there recently. Address. I'm sending coordinates now. It's 40 minutes south of you, off Route 286 deep in the Altar Valley. Nearest neighbor's 6 miles out. It's isolated on purpose, Maggie. This isn't some improvised hideout. Somebody planned this." Maggie's phone buzzed with the coordinates, a small red pin blooming on a map of empty desert scrub, and she stared at it the way a starving woman stares at a plate of food, hunger and caution fighting for the same breath. "I'm going out there tonight," she said. "Maggie, wait." "I'm not waiting, Frank. Every hour I wait is another hour that man has his hand on my grandson's shoulder. I'm not telling you to wait forever. I'm telling you to wait for daylight to fade completely and to let me pull you satellite imagery first, because if you go in blind and Kane's got eyes on every approach road, you're not rescuing Noah, you're joining him in a cell." Frank's voice dropped urgent. "You taught me that once. Remember recon before contact, every single time. No exceptions." Maggie closed her eyes. She could hear her own voice, 20 years younger, saying those exact words to a nervous new analyst in a briefing room that no longer existed. It landed like a slap hearing it thrown back at her. 2 hours, she said finally. "I'll give you 2 hours for imagery, not a minute more." 2 hours, Frank agreed. "I'll call this line the second I have eyes on that property." She hung up and looked down at her own hands, steady now. Steadier than they'd been in 11 years, and for a moment she almost didn't recognize them as her own. The 2 hours felt like 2 lifetimes. Maggie used them the way she had once used every dead hour before an operation. She made herself useful instead of anxious. She laid the manila folder open on the kitchen table and read it cover to cover for the first time in over a decade, refreshing every detail, every name, every account number that had once been worth killing for. 6 people had died the night she took this folder out of a farmhouse floor. She had buried their names alongside her own old identity, told herself she'd never have to look at any of it again. Halfway through page 11, her phone rang. Not Frank, not the kidnapper. A number she didn't recognize, but the area code made her stomach drop. Virginia. She let it ring twice before answering. "Yes." "Margaret Lawson." A woman's voice, this time crisp, professional, careful in the specific way government voices are careful. "My name is Special Agent Renata Cruz, FBI, Tucson Field Office. I understand your grandson Noah didn't come home from school today." Maggie's whole body went rigid. "How did you get this number?" "Tyler's mother filed a missing persons report an hour ago. We're treating it as a possible abduction. I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them honestly, because right now the clock on finding your grandson alive is the only thing that matters to me." Maggie shut her eyes. This was the exact complication. She couldn't afford a federal agent circling the one crime scene where federal attention would collapse. Everything would spook Kane into doing something irreversible, would turn a rescue into a hostage execution. "I don't have any information beyond what Tyler's mother already told you," Maggie said carefully. "My grandson didn't come home. I'm frantic. I don't know anything else." There was a pause on the line, and Maggie recognized that pause too. The pause of someone who had already read a file, who already knew more than they were letting on. "Mrs. Lawson," so Agent Cruz said slowly, I ran a routine background check before I called you, standard procedure for any next of kin. Your social security number generates a flag when I search it against certain federal databases. A flag I'm not cleared to see the contents of. Would you like to explain that to me, or would you like me to keep guessing? Maggie's grip tightened on the phone. I have no idea what you're talking about, she said, and hated how thin the lie sounded even to her own ears. Okay, Cruz said in a tone that made it clear she didn't believe a word of it. Then let me tell you what I think is happening, and you can correct me where I'm wrong. I think you know exactly who took your grandson. I think you have no intention of letting me or anyone else in law enforcement get within 100 miles of this. And I think that's the single worst decision you could possibly make right now. Because whoever these people are, they have resources, and you're one woman working below them. I appreciate your concern, Agent Cruz. Maggie's voice had gone flat, controlled the voice of a woman ending a conversation. I'll call you if I learn anything. Mrs. Lawson, Maggie hung up. She stood in her kitchen, breathing hard, and for the first time that whole terrible day, she let herself feel something close to real fear. Not fear for Noah. That fear had been constant since 347, a background hum she'd learned to function around, but fear that the walls she'd built around her old life were already starting to crack hours before she'd even reached the ranch. The satellite phone buzzed, Frank right on schedule. I've got imagery, he said breathless. And Maggie, it's worse than I thought. Show me. Sending now. Look at the northeast corner of the property. Maggie's laptop screen filled with grainy overhead imagery timestamped from 90 minutes earlier, a sprawling ranch compound ringed by chain link fencing, topped with something that glinted metallic in the low sun. Razor wire, not the kind of fencing you put up to keep cattle in. Count the vehicles, Frank said. 4 trucks, 2 SUVs, and what I'm 90% sure is an armored transport near the main house. Maggie, that's not cartel muscle. That's a paramilitary detail. Maggie leaned closer to the screen, her trained eye already parsing the image, the way it hadn't parsed anything in 11 years. Guard positions, likely rotation patterns, blind spots created by outbuilding shadows. How many men, she said. I count 9 visible in this pass. There could be more inside structures. Maggie, this isn't a rescue. This is an assault on a fortified position. It's a rescue, Maggie said quietly, because my grandson is inside it. I'm not arguing that. I'm telling you 9 armed men with military bearing is not something one 66-year-old woman walks through alone, no matter what she used to be. Frank, Maggie's voice was calm now, terrifyingly calm, the calm of a decision already made. 24 years ago, I walked into a compound with worse odds than this and walked out with a hostage and a dead colonel's ledger. The difference between me then and me now isn't skill. It's that back then I didn't have anyone waiting for me to fail. That's exactly my point, Frank said. You have someone waiting for you now. That should make you more careful, not less. It makes me more dangerous, Maggie said. There's a difference. She ended the call and sat with the imagery a long time, memorizing every angle, every fence line, every shadow. Then she packed her bag properly, not the frantic grab of 2 hours earlier, but the deliberate, unhurried packing of a professional preparing for a night she had trained her whole life for. At 9:40 that evening, her phone buzzed one final time before she left. A text from the unknown number. Kane's man checking his leash. 68 hours remaining, Margaret. Have you found your courage yet? She typed back nothing at all. She simply turned the phone to airplane mode, dropped it into her bag, and drove south into the dark toward Route 286, toward a ranch full of armed men, toward a version of herself she had buried under 11 years of church bake sales and telescope lessons, and a promise she had made to a photograph of her dead daughter that she would never let this life touch her grandson. That promise was already broken. Now all that was left was making it right. She left her car 2 miles out, tucked behind a stand of mesquite along a dry wash, and covered the remaining distance on foot, moving the way she'd been trained to move across open desert at night, low silent, reading the terrain instead of fighting it. 11 years hadn't erased the training. It had only put it to sleep, and sleep, she was discovering, with every careful step, was not the same as forgetting. She reached a rise overlooking the compound at 11:15 p.m. and lay flat against the cooling earth watching. The compound was exactly as bad as Frank's imagery had promised. Maybe worse in the way that only darkness and proximity can reveal. Floodlights ringed the main structure. Guards moved in a loose but disciplined rotation. She counted them twice to be certain, and the second count matched the first. 9 men, 2 of them carrying rifles slung with the ease of former military. This was not cartel muscle dressed up in tactical vests. This was trained personnel, and that told her everything she needed to know about who was really funding this operation. She lay there for 40 minutes motionless, memorizing rotations, memorizing the gap in coverage that opened for exactly 90 seconds every 11 minutes along the southeast fence line, memorizing which windows had light behind them and which sat dark. Then from an outbuilding near the northern edge of the compound, a door opened, spilling yellow light across the dirt, and a man stepped out, dragging a small figure by the arm. Maggie's whole body went cold and then instantly violently hot. Noah. He was stumbling, exhausted wrists still bound, and the man dragging him broad-shouldered, moving with unhurried cruelty, shoved him down onto the ground outside the outbuilding, like he was disposing of trash rather than handling a child. Noah cried out a small sound that carried impossibly far across the still night air, and Maggie's finger found the trigger guard of her weapon without her mind ever giving the order. Not yet, she told herself, forcing air into her lungs, forcing her pulse back down from somewhere near the stratosphere. Not yet. 1 shot fired now, and they kill him before you clear the fence line. Wait, watch, learn. The man crouched down beside Noah, said something Maggie couldn't hear from this distance, and laughed an ugly, satisfied sound that traveled across the desert and lodged itself directly into the center of Maggie's chest like a blade. Noah didn't answer him. He just curled into himself, small and shaking, and stared out into the darkness beyond the floodlights. Staring, Maggie realized with a jolt that nearly broke her composure entirely directly towards the rise where she was lying. He couldn't see her. He had no way of knowing she was there. But some part of him, some instinct, passed down through blood and love, was looking for her anyway. "I'm here," Maggie whispered into the dark so quietly the words barely disturbed the air in front of her lips. "I'm here, baby. Hold on just a little longer." The man hauled Noah back up by the arm and shoved him back through the outbuilding door, and it slammed shut, and the yellow light vanished, and the desert went dark and silent again, except for the low murmur of guards and the distant hum of a generator somewhere behind the main house. Maggie lay there another 10 minutes, letting her pulse settle, letting the rage cool from a wildfire into something more useful, a controlled burn, precise and purposeful. Then she began finally to move. She worked the southeast gap, first timing her approach to the 11-minute rotation, crossing the open ground between the rise and the fence line in a low crouch that ate the distance far faster than it looked like it should. She reached the fence with 40 seconds to spare and went to work on the chain link with wire cutters from her bag, snipping a gap just wide enough to slip through, careful to leave the cut edges pressed together so a casual glance from a passing guard wouldn't register anything wrong. Inside the fence line now, she pressed herself into the shadow of a water tank and waited, listening. Footsteps. 2 guards walking a slow patrol along the fence's interior, speaking low Spanish to each other, one of them laughing at something the other said. Maggie held perfectly still, breath shallow, until they passed within 15 feet of her position without ever once looking her direction. This was the part of her old life she remembered most clearly, more clearly than any weapon, any tactic, the discipline of stillness. The ability to become nothing, to disappear entirely into a shadow, to let fear and adrenaline exist somewhere below the surface of a body that showed absolutely nothing. She moved again once the guards had passed, working her way toward the outbuilding, staying low, staying to the dark seams between structures where the floodlights couldn't reach. She was 30 feet from the outbuilding door when a voice behind her, low and amused, stopped her cold. "You're better than the files said you'd be." Maggie spun, weapon rising, and found herself facing a man she hadn't seen approach at all. Tall, silver-haired, dressed in civilian clothes that did nothing to hide the way he carried himself, the unmistakable bearing of a man who had spent decades giving orders in rooms most people never knew existed. Victor Kane. "Hello, Margaret," he said softly, hands raised not in surrender but in a kind of mocking, theatrical calm. "It's been a very long time." "Where is he?" Maggie said, the weapon steady on his chest, voice absolutely level despite the hurricane happening behind her ribs. "Safe," Kane said. "For now, though I have to say I'm genuinely impressed. 9 guards motion sensors along the north perimeter, and you got this far without triggering a single alarm." I trained you well. You trained a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. Did I? Kane tilted his head, studying her the way a man studies a chess piece he thought he had already removed from the board. Because from where I'm standing, the woman in front of me looks exactly like the one who walked out of that farmhouse outside Ramadi with 6 dead men behind her and a ledger under her arm. 11 years of tomatoes and church bake sales doesn't erase that, Margaret. It just puts a very thin coat of paint over it. You sold classified intelligence to cartels and criminal networks, Maggie said. You betrayed every oath you ever swore, and now you kidnapped a child to get to me. There's nothing left in you worth talking to. Kane's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, a flicker of old resentment, carefully banked for years, finally given room to breathe. You want to talk about betrayal? I gave that agency 30 years. I recruited you, trained you, protected your career at every turn, and the moment I made one mistake, they buried me in a facility that doesn't officially exist and let everyone believe I was dead. You disappeared into a nice little life with a white picket fence. I disappeared into a concrete box with no windows. Don't lecture me about betrayal, Margaret. You have no idea what that agency is capable of once you stop being useful to them. So your solution was kidnapping an 11-year-old boy. My solution, Kane said, voice hardening, is recovering an archive that is worth more money than you can possibly imagine, to people who will pay whatever it costs to see it destroyed and using whatever leverage necessary to make that happen quickly. Your grandson isn't the target, Margaret. He's the key. Bring me the archive and he goes home tonight. It really is that simple. Nothing about this is simple, Maggie said. You know I'll never stop hunting you after tonight, whether you get the archive or not. Kane smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had already planned 3 moves ahead. That's exactly why the archive is only half of what I need from you tonight, Margaret. The other half is your cooperation. Lower the weapon. Let's talk like professionals, and maybe this ends with everyone walking away. Maggie's finger tightened fractionally on the trigger, and for one suspended electric second, she considered simply ending this right there, ending the entire nightmare with a single round before he could give any order to anyone. Then a voice crackled from a radio clipped to Kane's belt, and everything changed. Boss, we've got movement on the south fence, motion sensor tripped near Sector 4. Kane's eyes never left Maggie's face, but something in them sharpened. That's not possible. Nobody else knows about this location. Maggie's blood went cold because she knew exactly what that meant, and it had nothing to do with her. Boss, the radio crackled again, panic entering the guard's voice now. We've got vehicles, multiple vehicles approaching from the east access road, no lights. I think the words cut off in a burst of static and gunfire, distant but unmistakable, cracking across the desert night like the sky itself splitting open. Kane's composure shattered for the first time since Maggie had laid eyes on him. Who else did you bring? Nobody, Maggie said, and it was the absolute truth which made the fear in her chest even worse. Because if it wasn't her people out there, that left only one other terrifying possibility. More gunfire, closer now, shouting in Spanish, then English, then something that sounded distinctly military in its clipped, disciplined cadence. Floodlights around the compound began sweeping wildly as guards scrambled from their positions toward the sound of the assault. Kane grabbed Maggie's wrist with surprising speed, wrenching the weapon toward the ground, and for 3 violent seconds they grappled in the dark silence, except for ragged breathing, until Maggie drove her knee up into his ribs hard enough to fold him and broke free, weapon back up aimed at his chest. Don't move, she snarled. But Kane wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking past her toward the outbuilding, toward the sound of new gunfire erupting terrifyingly close to where her grandson was being held, and the calculation happening behind his eyes was one Maggie recognized instantly because she'd made the exact same calculation herself 100 times in her old life. He was deciding whether Noah was still worth more to him alive than dead. Whoever that is out there, Kane said, backing away slowly, hands still raised. They're about to make a very simple decision, very complicated. I'd suggest you decide quickly, Margaret, whether you're here to save your grandson or settle old scores with me. Because in about 90 seconds, you may not get to do both. He turned and ran toward the main house, shouting orders in rapid Spanish, and Maggie stood frozen for one single heartbeat, torn between the urge to put a round in his back and the far stronger, far older instinct screaming at her that every second wasted standing still was a second closer to losing Noah forever. She ran for the outbuilding. The gunfire had spread now, chaotic and close muzzle flashes strobing against the darkness from at least 3 different directions, and Maggie moved through it the way water moves through cracks, finding the gaps, the dead spaces, the seams between violence, where a body could pass unseen if it moved fast enough and low enough. A guard rounded the corner of the outbuilding directly into her path weapon rising, and Maggie didn't have room to hesitate. She closed the distance in 2 steps and put him down hard and fast, the kind of controlled, economical violence that 11 years of gardening and church potlucks had done absolutely nothing to erase from her hands. She reached the outbuilding door and found it locked, a heavy padlock through a steel hasp, and for one panicked second she genuinely didn't know if she had time to breach it before whatever was tearing through the compound reached this building too. "Noah!" she shouted, pounding on the door, all discipline, momentarily overwhelmed by pure animal desperation. "Noah, baby, it's Grandma." From inside, muffled but unmistakable, a boy's voice screamed back, cracking with terror and disbelief in equal measure. Grandma, I'm in here. Please get me out. I'm coming. Hold on." She raised the Glock and put 2 rounds through the padlock's shackle, the sound swallowed almost entirely by the gunfire already tearing through the night around them, and wrenched the ruined lock free, hauling the door open. Noah was curled in the corner of a bare dirt-floored room, wrists still bound, face streaked with dirt and tears. And when he saw her standing in the doorway, he made a sound that Maggie would hear in her dreams for the rest of her life. Pure, disbelieving relief, the sound of a drowning person finally breaking the surface of the water. "Grandma." He scrambled toward her, and she dropped to her knees and caught him, pulling him against her chest, one arm wrapped around him, while the other kept her weapon trained on the door behind them. Every instinct in her body split violently between the overwhelming need to hold him forever and the professional certainty that they were nowhere near safe yet. "I've got you," she whispered fiercely into his hair. I've got you, you're okay now." "I knew you'd come," Noah sobbed against her shoulder. "I told them you'd come, and they laughed at me, but I knew. "Always," Maggie said, cutting the zip ties from his wrist with 3 fast strokes of her knife. "Every single time for the rest of your life, I will always come." Outside, the gunfire was intensifying closer now, and through the doorway, Maggie caught a glimpse of headlights sweeping across the compound. Not the trucks and SUVs she'd counted earlier, but something larger, more organized, moving with a coordination that told her this was no rival cartel faction settling a score. A shadow fell across the doorway. Maggie spun, weapon rising, shielding Noah's body with her own in the same motion, and found herself staring at a man in tactical gear she had never seen before in her life. Rifle raised but not yet fired, eyes flicking between her weapon and the terrified boy pressed against her chest. "Lawson," the man said, and something in the way he said her name, not a question exactly, more a confirmation of something he had already been told to expect, made every alarm in Maggie's mind scream at once. "Margaret Lawson, stand down. We're not here for you." "Who are you?" Maggie demanded, weapon never wavering. "Doesn't matter right now," the man said, glancing over his shoulder toward the sound of continuing gunfire. "What matters is we've got maybe 2 minutes before this whole compound goes up, and you and the boy need to not be in it when that happens. Move now, questions later." Maggie hesitated exactly 1 second. 1 single second of pure professional distrust warring against the desperate need to get Noah somewhere safe. And in that second, an explosion tore through the main house behind them, the concussion wave rolling across the compound and knocking loose dirt from the outbuilding's roof, and the decision made itself. She pulled Noah up, wrapped one arm tight around his shoulders, and ran. They broke from the outbuilding into open ground, and the night that had been merely violent seconds earlier now felt like the inside of a furnace heat, rolling off the burning main house in visible waves, debris raining down in small black flakes that caught the firelight like dying embers. Noah's hand was locked around Maggie's wrist so tightly it would leave bruises she wouldn't notice until the following morning, and she didn't slow down to check. Didn't slow down for anything except the split-second calculations her body was making faster than her conscious mind could track, which shadows were safe, which weren't, which direction held less gunfire than the others. "Stay low, stay with me," she said into Noah's ear, and he nodded against her shoulder, too terrified to form words, his small chest heaving. The tactical operator who'd found them in the outbuilding moved ahead of them now, rifle up, clearing a path toward the fence line with a discipline that told Maggie everything she needed to know about his training, even though she still had no idea who he actually worked for. Two more figures in matching gear converged from the shadows near the water tank, falling into formation without a word exchanged between them. And Maggie realized with a jolt of something between relief and deep unease that this wasn't a chaotic raid. This was a coordinated extraction. Somebody had known exactly where to hit this compound, exactly when, and exactly who they were pulling out of it, which meant somebody had been watching her long before tonight. Fence gap 20 meters northeast corner, the lead operator called back, voice clipped and calm despite the chaos exploding around them. Move on my mark. Behind them, deeper in the compound, a fresh burst of gunfire erupted, and Maggie caught a glimpse over her shoulder of two of Kane's guards falling back toward the burning main house. Weapons abandoned, hands raised. Whoever these new arrivals were, they were not here for a fair fight. They were here to end this quickly and completely. Mark, the operator said, and they moved. They hit the fence gap at a dead run, Maggie half carrying Noah through the cut opening in the chain link, and on the other side engines were already running 3 unmarked SUVs, blacked out windows idling in a tight cluster 50 yards beyond the fence line. A rear door swung open before they even reached it. In, the operator said. Now. Maggie hesitated at the threshold of the vehicle, every instinct she'd ever trained, screaming that stepping into an unmarked vehicle with unidentified armed men was the single worst decision a person in her position could make. And then Noah made a small, exhausted sound against her side, half sob and half collapse, and the calculation resolved itself instantly. Whatever waited inside that SUV, it was still safer than what they were leaving behind. She climbed in after him, weapon still gripped in her free hand, and the door slammed shut, and the SUV lurched forward into the darkness, tires spinning briefly on loose gravel, before finding purchase and surging away from the burning compound. Through the rear window, Maggie watched the main house collapse in on itself, a pillar of orange fire climbing into the black desert sky, and somewhere behind that fire, Victor Kane was either dead or already running, and she genuinely did not know which possibility frightened her more. Noah. She turned to him, cupping his face in both hands, checking him with the fast, practiced efficiency of a woman who had once triaged wounded operators in far worse light than this. Look at me, baby. Are you hurt anywhere at all? Noah shook his head, tears streaking clean lines through the dirt on his cheeks. Just my wrists where the ties were. And I'm so tired, Grandma. I'm so tired. I know. She pulled him against her, one hand cradling the back of his head, and for the first time since 3:47, that afternoon allowed herself 3 full seconds of simply holding him, feeling his heartbeat hammering against her own chest, proof beyond any doubt that he was alive, that he was here, that the worst thing she could have imagined had not in the end come to pass. Then she looked up at the man in the front passenger seat, who had turned to watch them with an expression she couldn't quite place, something between professional detachment and genuine curiosity. Who are you? She said again, no longer a question, but a demand. The man reached up and pulled off a balaclava she hadn't even registered he was wearing, revealing a face that made every fragment of relief in Maggie's chest curdle instantly into fresh alarm. Younger than her by maybe 15 years, hard-jawed with pale gray eyes that held no particular warmth. A face she had seen once before, a lifetime ago, in a briefing photograph, clipped to a personnel file she'd been ordered to memorize and then forget. Marcus Webb, the man said. Special Activities Division. Retired technically, same as you. He allowed himself the ghost of a smile, though I imagine retired means something different when applied to the Desert Ghost. Maggie's grip on Noah tightened instinctively. That name doesn't exist anymore. With respect, ma'am, that name has been active in 3 separate intelligence chatter streams over the last 6 hours. Ever since you pulled a file out of a wardrobe compartment you thought nobody remembered you had. Webb's tone remained perfectly level, almost gentle, but the words landed like a slap. You're not as invisible as you think, Mrs. Lawson, which is exactly why we're here. Explain, Maggie said. Now, or you can let us out at the next intersection, and I'll find my own way home. Webb glanced briefly at Noah, then back to Maggie, weighing how much a child should hear, and apparently decided the boy had already survived worse than the truth. 6 months ago, my unit was tasked with locating and neutralizing a rogue former intelligence asset who'd been selling classified material to buyers across 3 continents. Victor Kane. We tracked him through a dozen false identities and 2 failed extraction attempts. Then 3 days ago, our surveillance picked up chatter indicating Kane had identified and located a former operative connected to his original disgrace, someone he believed was holding evidence that could clear his name and simultaneously destroy the people who'd buried him. Webb paused. That operative was you, Mrs. Lawson. We've had eyes on your residence since Sunday. We watched your grandson walk to school this morning. We watched the vehicle that took him. And then we watched you disappear into your own house and come out 40 minutes later, looking like an entirely different woman. Maggie absorbed this in silence, her mind racing through the implications, each one worse than the last. You let them take him, she said finally, voice dangerously quiet. You had eyes on my house, and you let them take my grandson. We had one asset embedded near the pickup point, Webb said, and for the first time something like genuine regret flickered across his composed features. He was outnumbered and outmatched in the moment, and by the time backup arrived, the vehicle was already gone. I won't pretend that isn't a failure on our part. It is. And I'm sorry for it more than you probably believe right now. But the operation tonight, tracking the ranch, coordinating the extraction that happened because we were already in position, already watching when you drove south 2 hours ago. If we hadn't been Mrs. Lawson, I don't think either of you walks out of that compound alive tonight, whatever your training. Maggie wanted badly to hate him for that admission, to funnel every ounce of the day's terror into blaming this stranger and his agency for the 11 hours her grandson had spent zip-tied on a dirt floor. But some old disciplined part of her recognized the truth in what he was saying, even as the rest of her raged against it. What happens now? She said instead. Now, Webb said, we get you both somewhere secure, we get the boy checked by a physician, and we talk. Because Mrs. Lawson Kane wasn't working alone tonight, and he wasn't working for cartel money alone either. The archive, he wanted the ledger you pulled out of that farmhouse 14 years ago. That ledger implicates people who are still very much active in positions of significant power. Kane was never going to simply hand that ledger to a criminal buyer and disappear. He was going to use it as leverage against the very agency that buried him. Tonight's raid may have gotten your grandson back, but it did not end this. Not even close. Noah stirred against Maggie's shoulder, half asleep. Now exhaustion finally overtaking terror. Now that his grandmother's arms were around him, and Maggie stroked his hair with one hand, while her mind worked through everything Webb had just told her, with the other half of her attention cold and clear and utterly focused. Did you get Kane? She asked. Tonight. Is he dead? Webb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We recovered 9 bodies from the compound. Kane wasn't among them. There's a service tunnel beneath the main house we didn't know existed until the fire exposed the entrance. He's gone. The words settled over Maggie like a physical weight, and beside her, even in his exhausted half-sleep, she felt Noah tense, some part of him still listening, even as sleep tried to claim him. Then this isn't over, Maggie said quietly. No, ma'am, Webb agreed. It isn't. They reached a safe house 40 minutes later, an unremarkable ranch-style home on the outskirts of a town Maggie didn't recognize, tucked at the end of a long gravel drive that gave any approaching vehicle no cover at all, exactly the kind of defensible position her old training would have chosen. Inside, a doctor was waiting, a quiet, efficient woman who examined Noah with gentle hands and pronounced him physically unharmed beyond the bruising dehydration and the kind of exhaustion that would take days, not hours, to fully resolve. Maggie sat beside the bed they'd given him, watching him finally truly sleep for the first time since the ordeal began, his small chest rising and falling in the slow, even rhythm of a boy who had, against every odd stacked against him, made it home safe. She reached out and smoothed the hair back from his forehead, the same gesture she'd made 1,000 times over 11 years of bedtime stories, and scraped knees and nightmares about his mother, and let herself, finally, in the privacy of that dim room, cry the tears she had refused herself all night. She was still sitting there when Webb knocked softly on the doorframe. He's stable, he said quietly, glancing at the sleeping boy. That's good. That's the best thing that's happened all day. What do you want, Agent Webb? 10 minutes of your time. There are things you need to know and things we need from you, and I'd rather have this conversation while you're still willing to have it with me instead of after you've decided I'm the enemy too. Maggie looked once more at Noah's sleeping face, then rose quietly, closing the bedroom door behind her, and followed Webb down a short hallway into a sparse living room where a laptop sat open on a coffee table, its screen glowing with a paused satellite feed of the still-smoking compound. "Sit," Webb said, and when Maggie remained standing, he simply continued unbothered. "The ledger you're carrying, the one Kane wanted, it's not just old history anymore. In the last 18 months, 3 of the names in that ledger have moved into significantly more powerful positions than they held 14 years ago. One of them now sits on a Senate Oversight Committee with direct access to classified intelligence budgets. If that ledger surfaces publicly, it ends careers, triggers indictments, possibly destabilizes ongoing operations. We can't discuss with you. If it surfaces in the wrong hands, Kane's hands, or whoever's actually funding him, it becomes the single most valuable piece of leverage in the country. So what are you asking me to do with it?" Maggie said, arms crossed, every muscle in her body still coiled tight from a night that refused to end. "We want it," Webb said simply. "Formally through proper channels with your cooperation and protection, guaranteed for both you and your grandson. Kane knows you have it. He's not going to stop hunting you until either he has it or he's dead. Give it to us, and we can build a case that ends. This permanently takes down Kane, exposes his buyers, and gets you and Noah into a level of protection that doesn't depend on you personally clearing every fence line in southern Arizona." Maggie was quiet for a long moment, weighing the offer against every hard lesson 14 years of intelligence work had ever taught her about trusting institutional promises. "The last time I trusted this agency to protect people who did the right thing," she said finally, "I ended up bearing my own name and building a life so far removed from the true that even my grandson didn't know who I really was until tonight. Forgive me, Agent Webb, if protection guaranteed doesn't land the way you're hoping it lands." Webb held her gaze unflinching. "I understand that, I do. But Mrs. Lawson Kane is not going to simply give up because tonight's raid failed. He's going to regroup, and the next time he comes for Noah, and there will be a next time, because that's exactly the kind of man he is, he's not going to be careless enough to let you walk in and get him back." The words hit exactly the target Webb intended them to hit, and Maggie felt the cold certainty of them settle into her chest alongside the exhaustion and the relief reshaping the shape of every decision still ahead of her. "Give me the night," she said finally. "Let my grandson sleep. Let me think. And in the morning I'll tell you what I've decided." Webb nodded slowly, accepting the terms, though something in his expression suggested he already suspected which way she would decide and simply hadn't wanted to push a woman who had in the space of 8 hours walked back into the exact fire she'd spent 11 years trying to escape. "Fair enough," he said. "Get some rest, Mrs. Lawson. You've more than earned it tonight." "Earned it, you know." Maggie didn't answer. She walked back down the hallway, eased open the bedroom door, and sat once more in the chair beside Noah's bed, watching him sleep, listening to the steady, unbroken rhythm of his breathing, proof over and over that the worst had not happened, that she had reached him in time. But somewhere out in the desert, dark beyond the reach of any floodlight or satellite feed, Victor Kane was still alive, still moving, still carrying every ounce of the hatred and betrayal he'd nursed for 11 long years inside a concrete box, and Maggie knew with the same cold certainty that had once kept her alive through 6 years of the most dangerous work a government could ask of anyone, that this fight was nowhere close to finished. It had only just begun. Morning came gray and quiet, and Maggie hadn't slept at all. She'd spent the hours between 3 and 6 sitting in that chair beside Noah's bed, running Webb's offer through every filter 14 years of tradecraft had ever taught her. And by the time the first light touched the curtains, she had her answer, not because she trusted the agency, but because she had run out of better options. And a woman who had once survived on nothing but better options now had to admit she needed help. Noah stirred just after 7, blinking against the pale morning light, disoriented for one frightening half-second before his eyes found her sitting there and his whole small body relaxed. "You're still here," he said, voice rough with sleep. "I told you I always would be," Maggie said, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "How are you feeling?" "My wrists hurt, and I'm hungry." He hesitated, studying her face with the particular unflinching honesty only children seem to possess. "Grandma, who were those men last night? The ones who came for us?" Maggie had known this question was coming since the moment she'd carried him out of that burning compound, and she still hadn't decided in all those sleepless hours exactly how much of the truth an 11-year-old boy deserved to carry. They were people who helped protect other people, she said carefully, like soldiers but a different kind. And you knew how to fight them. Noah said slowly, working through it with the careful logic of a child assembling a puzzle from pieces that didn't quite match the picture on the box. The men who took me. You knew how to get past the guards. You shot the lock off the door. His eyes searched hers wide and uncertain. Grandma, how did you know how to do all that? Maggie exhaled slowly and made a decision that would reshape the rest of both their lives. A long time ago, she said, sitting down on the edge of his bed and taking his small hand in both of hers. Before your mama was born, I did a very different kind of job, a secret job for the government. I helped keep bad people from hurting good people. It was dangerous, and it meant I couldn't tell anyone the truth about what I did, not even the people I loved most. Noah's eyes widened. Like a spy. Something like that. That's so cool, he breathed, and then immediately his face crumpled with a confusion. But then why did you stop? Why did you become just a grandma? The word landed harder than he could have known, and Maggie felt her throat tighten around an answer that had been true for 11 years and was now in this room in this moment being spoken aloud for the very first time. Because after your mama died, she said quietly, I looked at you, this tiny baby who needed someone, and I realized I didn't want to be a spy anymore. I wanted to be your grandma. All the way. Not part-time, not in secret. I wanted every single day I had left to belong to you. She squeezed his hand. And it did, Noah. Every single day since has belonged to you. What happened yesterday, that wasn't me going back to my old life. That was me protecting the thing my old life was never able to give me. You. Noah was quiet for a long moment, processing this with the particular gravity children reserve for the truths that actually matter. Are the bad men going to come back? He asked, finally, small and scared again. Maggie wanted desperately to lie to him. Wanted to promise him it was over, that the fire and the guns and the terror belonged entirely to yesterday and would never touch either of them again. But she had built this boy's entire life on honesty, and she was not going to break that now, of all moments when it mattered most. I don't know, she said, but I want you to know something, and I want you to believe it with your whole heart. Whatever happens, whatever comes, I am not going to let anything happen to you. I fought my way through 9 armed men in a burning building to get you back, and I will do it again and again, as many times as it takes for as long as I'm breathing. Do you understand me? Noah nodded slowly, and then, in the way only children can manage after a night of pure terror, allowed himself a small, wobbling smile. You're kind of a badass grandma. Despite everything, despite the exhaustion, the fear still coiled tight in her chest. The impossible decision waiting for her down the hallway. Maggie laughed a real laugh, startled out of her by the sheer audacity of an 11-year-old dropping a curse word in the same breath as pure adoration. Language, she said, but she was still smiling when she said it. She found Webb in the kitchen 20 minutes later, nursing a cup of coffee he clearly hadn't slept enough to properly enjoy. And he looked up when she entered with the expression of a man who had spent the night preparing arguments he now realized he might not need. You've decided, he said. I have conditions, Maggie said, sitting across from him. First, Noah does not become a piece of this. No safe houses that pull him out of school indefinitely. No protective detail that turns his life into a prison. Whatever happens with Cain, it happens somewhere far away from my grandson permanently. Agreed, Webb said. That was always the plan. Second, I want everything you have on Cain's operation. Every name, every account, every property. If I'm handing over that ledger, I want to know exactly what I'm handing it into, and I want assurances that it doesn't simply disappear into a filing cabinet the way the original operation did. Webb's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. I can get you clearance for what's relevant. Not everything, some of it's above even my pay grade, but enough that you'll know your grandson's suffering bought something real. Third, Maggie said, and here her voice dropped hardened, carrying an edge that made Webb sit up straighter in his chair. I want to be there when you take Cain down, not as an observer, as part of the operation. Webb was already shaking his head before she finished the sentence. Mrs. Lawson, with respect, that's not how this works. You're a civilian now. Whatever your history, I can't put a 66-year-old grandmother into an active tactical operation. You put a 66-year-old grandmother into an active tactical operation last night, Maggie said flatly. Except I did it entirely alone against 9 armed men, and I walked out with my grandson and a body count that saved your team a great deal of trouble when you arrived. Don't insult me by pretending age is the disqualifying factor here, Agent Webb. We both know it isn't. A long silence stretched between them, filled with the particular tension of two professionals recognizing reluctantly that the other one was right. I'll talk to my director, Webb said finally. I'm not promising anything, but I'll talk to him. Good, Maggie said, because Victor Kane didn't just take my grandson to get an archive, Agent Webb. He took my grandson to prove a point that age had made me weak, that the desert ghost was a myth he could safely provoke. I intend to make sure that's the very last mistake he ever makes. The director's name was Elaine Voss, and she arrived by helicopter just after noon, a spare, silver-haired woman in her early 60s, whose eyes carried the particular weariness of someone who had spent 3 decades cleaning up messes other people's ambition had created. She sat across from Maggie in the safe house's small living room, Webb standing quietly by the window and studied Maggie for a long moment before speaking. I read your file this morning, Voss said. Or what's left of it, most of it's still classified above my clearance, which tells you something about how seriously this agency took burying you when you walked away. She paused. For what it's worth, Mrs. Lawson, I'm sorry it took your grandson getting kidnapped for anyone to finally acknowledge what you did for this country. I didn't do it for acknowledgement, Maggie said. I did it because it needed doing. I'd appreciate the same courtesy. Now skip the sentiment. Tell me what you actually need from me. Voss allowed herself a small, respectful nod, the look of someone recalibrating their approach in real time. Fair enough. Here's where we stand. Kane escaped last night through a service tunnel we didn't know existed. Our tracking indicates he crossed into a second property roughly 60 miles east within 4 hours of the raid, another cash-purchased holding, another shell company, same law firm out of Panama. He's regrouping, and based on the chatter we're picking up, he's accelerating his timeline rather than slowing it down. He knows we're closing in. Desperate men make desperate moves. What kind of moves? Maggie said. Our intelligence suggests Kane's original buyer, the party actually funding this entire operation, has grown impatient with his failure to deliver the ledger. There's a very real possibility Kane attempts something more drastic in the next 48 hours, either to recover the archive by force or to cut his losses and disappear entirely with whatever he already has. Voss leaned forward. Which is where you come in, Mrs. Lawson. Agent Webb tells me you have requested to be part of the operation to finally bring Kane in. I want to be honest with you about what that means. This isn't a rescue anymore. This is a hunt. And hunting a man who trained half your original tradecraft is not something I take lightly, regardless of your history. Neither do I, all right, Maggie said, which is exactly why you need me in the room. Kane doesn't think like your tactical teams think. He thinks like an operative who spent 30 years anticipating exactly how agencies like yours respond to threats. If you go in with standard protocol, he'll see it coming from a mile away and disappear again, and next time, he won't leave my grandson as leverage. He'll simply eliminate anyone who might interfere with his exit. Contact, she said quietly into the earpiece and heard Webb's voice tighten in response. Answer it. Keep him talking as long as you can. Maggie answered. Hello, Victor. A pause on the other end longer than she expected, and when Kane's voice finally came through, something in it had changed since the compound, some of the polished calm, had cracked and replaced by something rawer, more dangerous. You cost me 9 men and $100 million of infrastructure last night, Margaret. There's a briefing at 1400, Voss said finally. You'll be in the room, advisory capacity only, at least on paper. I have to be able to justify this to people above me who are going to ask very uncomfortable questions about civilian involvement in a federal operation. But your read on Kane's psychology, his likely movements, his fallback patterns, that's more valuable to us right now than another 6 operators with rifles. Understood, Maggie said. They didn't bury me, Victor. I walked away. There's a difference, and you've never once been able to understand it. The difference, Kane said, voice hardening, is that I still have something they want desperately, and you're about to help me get it whether you realize that yet or not. Maggie's pulse spiked though her voice stayed level. I don't have the ledger anymore. I handed it over this morning. I know, Kane said, and the casual certainty in his voice sent ice through her veins. I have someone inside that operation, Margaret. I've had someone inside that operation for years. Did you really think an agency this size runs entirely clean? You of all people should know better." The words hit like a physical blow, and Maggie's eyes flicked instinctively toward the kitchen window, toward the darkness beyond it, where 6 operators were supposedly standing guard. And for one horrifying second, she wondered which of them, if any, might be exactly what Kane had just claimed. "You're lying," she said, though she wasn't entirely certain anymore. "Am I then explained to me, Margaret, how I knew within 20 minutes that Director Voss authorized this exact operation? Explain to me how I knew you'd be sitting in that kitchen at night, wired for sound, 6 operators positioned around a perimeter that a man with the right information could walk through like it wasn't even there." Kane's voice dropped quiet and almost gentle now, which somehow made it far more frightening than his anger had been. "I'm not calling to threaten you tonight, Margaret. I'm calling to give you one final chance to end this the right way. Meet me. Boom. No wire, no backup, no federal shadows. Bring me proof the archive has been destroyed, not handed to your new friends destroyed, and I disappear forever. Your grandson never sees me again. You go back to your garden and your church potlucks, and I go back to whatever life is left for a man like me. And if I refuse, then I burn everything down, Margaret. Not just you, not just the boy, everyone in that agency who thinks they buried me successfully once already. I have 14 years of material on people who would very much prefer it stayed buried, and I promise you, once it starts coming out, there will be no controlling where it stops." Maggie closed her eyes, feeling the trap tighten around her from a direction none of Voss's careful planning had accounted for. "Where?" she said quietly. "The old mission church outside Sonoita. You remember it. We used it once years ago for a handoff that went considerably smoother than this one has." "Midnight, alone, Margaret. I'll know if you're not." The line went dead. Maggie sat frozen for 3 full seconds before Webb's voice erupted in her earpiece, sharp with urgency. "Lawson, do not engage on his terms. Repeat, do not agree to a solo meet. We have no idea what kind of position that church puts you in." "He says there's someone inside your operation," Maggie said quietly, cutting him off. "He knew about tonight before I even walked back through this door." Silence on the other end of the line, heavy and damning. "That's not possible," Webb said finally, though the certainty in his voice had thinned considerably. "This op was compartmentalized to 12 people total." "Then one of those 12 people is working for him," Maggie said. "Or Kane is lying to make me distrust the only backup I have. Either way, Agent Webb, I can't sit in this kitchen debating probability while he's counting down to midnight." "Give me 20 minutes, Webb said. "Let me talk to Voss." "You have 10, Maggie said and pulled the earpiece out, setting it deliberately on the kitchen table, because if there was even a possibility that someone inside this operation was compromised, she was no longer certain the earpiece itself could be trusted. She sat alone in her kitchen for exactly 6 of those 10 minutes, running the calculation the way she'd been trained to run it decades ago, weighing trust against risk, protocol against instinct, the safety of an entire federal operation against the singular burning need to end this, before Kane made good on a threat that could reach far beyond her own family. At minute 7, Director Voss herself appeared at the kitchen door, having driven over personally rather than trusting the conversation to radio traffic, her expression grave in the low kitchen light. "Talk to me," Voss said, sliding into the chair across from Maggie, the same chair Noah usually occupied for breakfast. "He knows things he shouldn't know," Maggie said. "Details about tonight's operation that were supposedly compartmentalized. Either he's bluffing to manipulate me, or he genuinely has someone inside your organization." Voss's jaw tightened, but she didn't dismiss the possibility outright, which told Maggie everything she needed to know about how seriously the director was taking the threat. "I'll run an internal review the moment this is over. But right now, we don't have time to solve that problem before midnight." What did he ask for? A solo meet at the old mission church outside Sonoita. Proof the archive's been destroyed, or he starts releasing material that implicates people well beyond just himself. "That's not a negotiation," Voss said flatly. "That's an ambush waiting to happen." "I know exactly what it is," Maggie said. "I also know that if I don't show up, he's not going to simply give up and go quietly. He's going to escalate, and the next escalation isn't going to be a phone call, Director Voss. It's going to be my grandson again, or worse, something aimed at people who have nothing at all to do with any of this." Voss studied her for a long moment, weighing the operational nightmare of a compromised perimeter against the very real possibility that refusing Kane's terms simply accelerated the exact disaster they were trying to prevent. "If you go, Voss said slowly. You go with a plan that doesn't depend on trusting anyone inside my operation who Kane might have already turned. That means minimal communication, a fallback extraction route only you and I know about, and a version of backup that looks nothing like what we briefed this afternoon. I'm listening, Maggie said. Voss leaned forward, voice dropping to barely above a whisper, and for the next several minutes the two women built a plan together in the quiet of Maggie's kitchen. A plan built not on trust in an institution that had already failed her once before, but on the same cold, careful tradecraft that had kept Maggie alive through 24 years of exactly this kind of impossible choice. When they finished, Voss sat back, studying Maggie with something that had shifted somewhere in the last 10 minutes from professional respect into something closer to genuine solidarity. You know, Voss said quietly, in another life, I think we'd have made a formidable team, you and I. In another life, Maggie said, rising from the table, I'd have liked that very much. In this one, I just want to go home to my grandson and never think about any of this again. Then let's make sure that's exactly what happens, Voss said, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, Maggie allowed herself to believe just slightly that it might actually be possible. She checked her weapon one final time in the quiet of her bedroom, the same room where this had all truly started less than 24 hours earlier, and caught her own reflection in the mirror above her dresser, a 66-year-old woman in a dark jacket, silver hair pulled back tight, and eyes holding a calm, lethal focus that hadn't surfaced in over a decade. She thought of Noah safe now, asleep in a borrowed bed miles away, trusting completely in a promise she had made him that morning. I am going to finish this, and then I am going to come home. She holstered her weapon, closed her bedroom door behind her, and walked out into the dark toward a car waiting to carry her to a crumbling desert mission church toward a midnight meeting with a man who had once been her mentor, and was now in every way that mattered, the last enemy standing between her family and peace. The clock in her kitchen read 10:52 as she pulled out of the driveway. She had less than 70 minutes to reach Sonoita, and considerably less time than that to decide exactly how this confrontation was going to end. The road to Sonoita unspooled dark and empty beneath her headlights, and Maggie drove it the way she used to drive toward every operation that mattered, on controlled breathing mind, already 3 moves ahead, replaying every possible version of what waited for her at that mission church until the fear had nowhere left to hide. Her phone buzzed once, a text from Voss. Fallback team in position 2 miles out. Radio silence unless you break contact protocol. You know what that means. She did. 3 words spoken into an open line that would tell a team hidden in the desert scrub to stop waiting and start moving. Everything else was on her. At 11:41, she crested a low-rise and saw at the old mission, a crumbling adobe silhouette against a sky thick with stars. Bell tower missing half its roof, the whole structure looking like something the desert had been slowly swallowing for 100 years. A single vehicle sat parked near the entrance. No lights, no visible guards. That absence of visible guards frightened her more than a compound full of them would have. She parked 30 yards back exactly as planned and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, feeling her own pulse in her throat. Okay, she whispered to no one. Okay. She stepped out into the cold desert night and walked toward the mission, a lone weapon, holstered but accessible, every sense straining against the darkness for movement that wasn't there. The church door hung half off its hinges, and inside a single lantern burned on what remained of an old stone altar, casting long shadows across crumbling pews, and a roof open to the stars in 3 separate places. Victor Kane stood beside the altar, hands clasped behind his back, looking for all the world like a man attending his own quiet funeral. You came alone, he said without turning. You said you'd know if I didn't. I would have. He turned then, and in the lantern light his face looked older than it had at the compound, deeper lines of weariness that hadn't been visible 24 hours earlier. Thank you, Margaret, for once taking me at my word. Don't mistake this for trust, Maggie said, stopping 10 feet from him, close enough to see his hands far enough to react if they moved wrong. I'm here because you threatened to burn down more than just of my family if I didn't come. That threat still stands, Kane said. Yeah. Do you have proof the archive's been destroyed? No, Maggie said flatly, because it hasn't been. It's in federal custody exactly where it belongs, and it's going to stay there until every name in that ledger faces exactly what they deserve. Kane's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, a flicker of something that might have been disappointment or might have been exactly what he'd expected all along. I had hoped, he said quietly, that after everything you might still remember what loyalty looks like. I remember exactly what loyalty looks like, Maggie said. It looks like a woman walking into a burning compound to save her grandson. It doesn't look like selling secrets to cartels and calling it justice for the way your career ended. You have no idea what my career ended over, Kane snapped, and for the first time real heat entered his voice. 11 years of buried resentment, finally finding daylight. You think I sold intelligence for money, Margaret? I sold it because the people running this country's intelligence apparatus were burying operations that got good agents killed to protect politically connected donors. I had evidence, real evidence. And instead of an investigation, I got a black site and 11 years of my life erased. His hands still clasped behind his back, tightened visibly. The ledger you're protecting so righteously right now, it doesn't just implicate cartels and corrupt officials. Margaret, it implicates the very people who buried me. The same people currently sitting in that safe house, promising you protection. Maggie felt something cold slide down her spine, because there was a version of this claim that lined up disturbingly well with things she'd already noticed the ease with which Kane had known about tonight's operation, the certainty in his voice when he described a mole inside Voss's team. You're lying, she said, though the conviction in her own voice had thinned considerably. Am I? Kane reached slowly into his jacket and Maggie's hand moved instantly toward her weapon, freezing him mid-motion. Easy, Margaret. I'm simply reaching for proof. Slowly, she said, and watched his every movement as he withdrew a small flash drive, holding it up between two fingers. This is a copy of internal agency correspondence from 14 years ago, Kane said, discussing in explicit terms the decision to bury the Zagros operation, not to protect national security, but to protect 3 individuals whose financial entanglements the ledger would have exposed. One of those individuals, Margaret, currently sits 2 levels above Director Voss in the agency's org chart. Voss herself may have no idea, but someone above her does, and that someone has every incentive in the world to make sure that ledger never sees daylight, which means, Margaret, that the moment you hand it fully into their custody, you've handed them the exact leverage they need to bury it a second time, permanently. Maggie stared at the flash drive mind, racing through implications that made the entire framework of trust she'd built with Voss over the last 18 hours feel suddenly sickeningly fragile. Why are you telling me this? She said. What do you actually want, Victor? I want the same thing I've wanted since the day I walked into that black site, Kane said. I want the truth to come out, not through some quiet government-controlled channel that disappears the moment it becomes inconvenient. I want it public. I want it undeniable. And I need your help to make that happen because you're the only person alive who was actually there for the original operation, the only credible witness left who can verify the ledger's authenticity when it goes public. You want me to help you leak classified material, Maggie said slowly. I want you to help me finish what we started 14 years ago, Kane said. Together this time, instead of you walking away and leaving me to face the consequences alone. For a long moment, Maggie said nothing, standing in the ruined church beneath a broken roof full of stars, weighing a proposal that came wrapped in enough truth to be genuinely dangerously seductive. Then she thought of Noah's small hand locked around her wrist as they ran from a burning building. She thought of the bruise on his cheekbone in a photograph designed to break her. She thought of 9 dead men who had died protecting Kane's operation, and however many more had died or would die because of whatever plan he was now asking her to join. No, she said quietly. Kane's expression flickered surprise, breaking through his careful composure for the first time. Margaret, you didn't come here tonight to offer me a partnership, Victor, Maggie said. You came here because you're out of options, out of resources, and you need one final asset to finish a job you've been running for years, and you thought guilt and old loyalty might work where money and threats already failed. She shook her head slowly. Whatever happened to you was wrong. I believe that. I believe someone buried an investigation to protect people who didn't deserve protecting. But you don't fix injustice by kidnapping children and burning down compounds and getting 9 men killed. You just become exactly the kind of monster you claim to be fighting. Kane's jaw tightened, and something in his posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the shift of a man abandoning one strategy for another. I gave you a chance to end this the right way, he said, voice gone cold and flat. You should have taken it. Is that a threat? It's a fact, Kane said, and raised two fingers to his ear, and Maggie understood in the half-second before chaos erupted that she had walked into exactly the trap she'd feared from the very beginning. The church's remaining windows shattered inward simultaneously, and three men in tactical gear dropped through the gaps in the roof, weapons already tracking, and Maggie moved on pure instinct, diving behind the stone altar as gunfire tore through the space where she'd been standing. A half-second earlier, chips of ancient adobe exploding into the air around her. "Kane," she shouted over the gunfire. "You said alone." "I lied," Kane called back, already moving toward the rear of the church, unhurried. Even now, the calm of a man who had planned every contingency well in advance. "You taught me that too, Margaret. Never walk into a negotiation without an insurance policy." Maggie's earpiece, which she'd reinstalled before leaving her house, despite her suspicions, because some backup was still better than none, crackled to violent life. "Lawson, we have gunfire. Say your status. Say your status now." "Compromised," Maggie shouted, ducking as another burst of rounds chewed through the altar stone inches above her head. Three shooters church interior, Kane's making a run for the rear exit. "Fallback team is 30 seconds out. Hold position if you can." 30 seconds. In her old life, 30 seconds had been an eternity. Tonight, crouched behind a crumbling stone altar, with three trained shooters closing in from multiple angles, it felt like the entire remaining span of her life compressed into a single unbearable countdown. She came up firing two fast rounds that caught the nearest shooter's center mass and dropped him before he'd even fully registered her position, and immediately dropped back behind cover as the remaining two redirected fire toward her exact location, rounds chewing splinters from the old wooden pews to her left. "Two left," she reported, breathless, reloading with hands that were shaking now despite every ounce of discipline she was throwing at them. Kane's clear, moving toward the rear exit. "Let him go," Webb's voice cut through, urgent. "Fallback team can pursue. Your priority is surviving the next 30 seconds. A shooter appeared at the edge of the altar, weapon swinging toward her, and Maggie moved without thinking, closing the distance in a single desperate lunge, driving her weapon up under his rifle and putting a round through him at point-blank range before he could adjust his aim. He crumpled, and she barely had time to register the kill before the second shooter opened fire from the opposite side of the church, rounds forcing her back down behind the altar's crumbling stone edge. Outside, faintly, she heard new engine sounds. Vehicles approaching fast, the fallback team finally closing the distance, and the remaining shooter, hearing the same sound, made the calculation Maggie recognized instantly from decades of watching men make exactly this choice under exactly this pressure. He broke and ran for the exit Kane had already used. Maggie didn't chase him. She stayed low, weapon up, breathing hard, listening as the sound of his retreat faded into the desert dark. And only when the church had gone fully silent again, nothing but her own ragged breathing and the distant approach of the fallback vehicles, did she finally allow herself to stand. Two bodies lay in the ruined church, lit by the single still-burning lantern on the altar. Kane was gone. His third shooter was gone. And somewhere out in that dark desert, a man who had just proven he would sacrifice anyone, including men working directly for him, to buy himself 30 seconds of escape, was already disappearing into whatever contingency plan he'd built for exactly this outcome. The fallback team burst through the church's broken door 40 seconds later, weapons up, sweeping the interior with practiced efficiency before converging on Maggie's position. "Clear," the lead operator called. "Lawson, you hit." "No," Maggie said, lowering her weapon slowly, hands still trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline finally beginning to recede. "Kane's gone. Went out the rear before you arrived." "We've got a vehicle leaving the property, moving fast, heading south," a voice crackled over the operator's radio. "No visual on driver." "That's him," Maggie said. "Don't let him reach the highway." The team moved out fast, pursuit vehicles already peeling off into the dark, and Maggie stood alone in the ruined church for one long moment, staring down at the flash drive Kane had dropped somewhere in the chaos, lying now among broken glass and spent shell casings near the altar's base. She picked it up slowly, turning it over in her fingers, weighing everything Kane had told her about corruption reaching above Voss, about the ledger being buried a second time by people with far more power than a single retired operative could ever hope to expose alone. Whatever else was true about Victor Kane, however far he'd fallen, however many lines he'd crossed, some small, cold part of her recognized that not everything he'd said tonight had been a lie. And that recognition, sitting heavy in her chest as she pocketed the drive without mentioning it to anyone, marked the exact moment Margaret Lawson stopped trusting this operation completely, even as she continued walking through every motion of cooperating with it. The pursuit lasted 11 minutes and ended badly. Maggie heard it unfold over the radio from the passenger seat of a vehicle racing to catch up with the chase, clipped urgent transmissions describing Kane's vehicle running a checkpoint, forcing a collision that took one pursuit vehicle out of the chase entirely. Then finally 12 miles south of the mission, losing control on a tight desert curve and rolling twice before coming to rest in a ravine. By the time Maggie's vehicle arrived at the scene, floodlights had already been set up, illuminating the wreckage in harsh white light, and Webb met her at the perimeter with an expression that told her everything before he spoke a single word. "He's alive," Webb said. "Barely. Broken ribs, possible internal bleeding, unconscious when we pulled him out. Medevac's inbound." Maggie walked to the edge of the ravine and looked down at the wreckage, at the shape of a man she had once trusted with her life, being loaded onto a stretcher by paramedics, working with brisk, impersonal efficiency, and felt none of the satisfaction she had expected to feel at this exact moment. "Will he survive?" she asked quietly. "Doctors give it 50-50, Webb said. "If he does, he's facing charges that will keep him in federal custody for the rest of his natural life. Treason, kidnapping, multiple counts of accessory to murder. This ends tonight, Mrs. Lawson, one way or the other." Maggie said nothing, watching the stretcher disappear into a waiting ambulance, and thought about the flash drive sitting in her jacket pocket, about corruption that might reach far higher than any charge sheet would ever acknowledge, about a truth Kane had offered her in exchange for a partnership. She'd refused a truth that might now die with him in a hospital bed, or might, if she was very careful about who she trusted next, still find its way into daylight. "Mrs. Lawson," Voss's voice arriving behind her, and Maggie turned to find the director studying her with an expression of genuine weary relief. "You're all right." "I'm all right," Maggie confirmed. "Kane's second shooter was apprehended 2 miles from the church," Voss said. "He's talking already, hoping for a deal. Between his statement and whatever we recover from Kane's properties, I think we finally have enough to close this out completely. Kane, his buyers, the whole network." "That's good," Maggie said, and meant it even as some careful, guarded part of her filed away Kane's warning about corruption above Voss's pay grade, deciding that tonight was not the night to test whether that warning had been truth or manipulation. "You did good work tonight," Voss said. "Better than good. I don't think this operation closes out cleanly without you in that church." "I just want to go home," Maggie said. "I want to hold my grandson, and I want to sleep in my own bed, and I want more than anything in this world to never hear the words classified operation again for as long as I live." Voss's mouth curved into something gentle, almost sad. "I understand that more than you probably realize. But Mrs. Lawson, Margaret, there's going to be a debrief. Congressional oversight is already asking questions about last night's raid, about a private citizen's involvement in 2 consecutive federal operations. I'll do everything in my power to protect you and your grandson from public exposure. But I need you to understand that the coming weeks aren't going to be simple, no matter how badly you and I both want them to be." Maggie closed her eyes briefly, feeling the exhaustion of the last 30 hours settle fully into her bones for the first time, and nodded. "One thing at a time," she said. "Right now, I want my grandson." She reached the safe house just after 2 in the morning and found Noah awake despite the hour, curled on a couch in the living room with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, watching the door with the particular vigilance of a child who had promised himself he wouldn't sleep until he saw his grandmother walk through it safely. The moment he saw her, he was up and across the room before she'd even fully cleared the doorway, and Maggie caught him and held him, feeling the last of the night's tension finally completely drain out of her body. "You came back," he said into her shoulder, voice thick with relief and exhaustion. "I told you I would every single time." "Is it over?" Noah pulled back to look at her, searching her face with wide, hopeful eyes. "Is the bad man gone?" Maggie thought of Kane unconscious and broken in a hospital bed, of a flash drive hidden in her jacket pocket, holding truths she hadn't yet decided what to do with, of a director promising protection, while an unnamed threat somewhere above her pay grade remained entirely unaddressed. "He can't hurt us anymore," she said, which was true and which was also carefully not quite the same thing as saying it was over. Noah studied her a moment longer, and then, satisfied by whatever he found in her expression, allowed himself to relax fully into her arms, exhaustion finally overtaking the last of his vigilance. "Can we go home now?" he asked, voice already softening towards sleep. "I want to sleep in my own bed." "Soon," Maggie said, stroking his hair. "I promise you, baby. Soon." She carried him back to the bedroom, tucked him in, and sat beside him until his breathing settled into the slow, even rhythm of genuine sleep. And only then did she allow herself to sink into the chair beside his bed and finally exhale the breath she felt like she'd been holding for 30 straight hours. Through the window, the first gray hint of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern sky, and Maggie sat watching it slowly brighten, thinking about everything that had happened since a phone call at 3:47 the previous afternoon had torn her entire carefully built life apart. The compound, the fire Kane's ranch collapsing into rubble, the mission church and its broken windows, a man she'd once trusted lying now in a hospital bed, facing the rest of his life behind bars. She thought too about the flash drive in her jacket pocket and about a choice she hadn't yet made and knew with the same cold certainty that had guided every decision of the last day and a half that she would eventually have to make, regardless of how badly she wanted this entire nightmare to simply be finished. Because Kane had been a monster, undeniably, unforgivably a man who had kidnapped a child and gotten 9 of his own men killed and nearly gotten Maggie herself killed twice in the span of 24 hours. But monsters she had learned a long time ago in a career built entirely on secrets and half-truths were rarely the whole story. Sometimes they were simply the visible wreckage left behind by something far larger, far better hidden, still operating comfortably in rooms most people never knew existed. She didn't know yet whether the truth on that flash drive was real or whether it was one final manipulation from a desperate man trying to drag her down with him. But she knew sitting in that quiet room watching dawn break over a desert that had tested her in every possible way over the last day and a half, that she owed it to herself and to Noah and to every operative who had ever died quietly in service of secrets that outlived them to find out for certain before she let this rest. Not tonight. Tonight she simply wanted to watch her grandson sleep safe and whole and breathing and let that single simple miracle be enough, but soon. Outside, the sun finally cleared the mountains, spilling gold light across the desert floor, and somewhere far beyond the safe house walls, in hospital rooms and federal offices and rooms that officially did not exist, the consequences of the last 30 hours were only just beginning to unfold. Consequences that would follow Margaret Lawson and her grandson long after the bruises faded, and the headlines, if there ever were any, went quiet. The war Victor Kane had started was over. But the truth he tried to hand her in a ruined desert church in the last desperate minutes before everything fell apart was only just beginning to breathe. The debrief came 4 days later in a windowless federal building in Tucson that smelled of stale coffee and recycled air, and Maggie sat across a long table from 3 people whose names she was told, but would forget within the hour: an assistant director, a congressional liaison, and a lawyer whose sole function seemed to be inserting the phrase "off the record" into every third sentence. They asked her to walk through everything: the phone call, the compartment behind the wardrobe, the compound, the mission church. She gave them the version that matched Voss's report almost exactly, because she had decided somewhere in the 4 days since dawn broke over that safe house that the flash drive in her jacket pocket was not a piece of evidence she was ready to hand over to a room full of strangers who might bury it exactly the way Kane had claimed his own investigation had been buried 14 years earlier. "And you have no further contact with Kane's network since the church incident?" The assistant director said, not quite a question. "None," Maggie said, which was true. Kane himself remained in a federal medical facility, still recovering from injuries that had nearly killed him, under guard around the clock, awaiting an arraignment that his lawyers were already working to delay indefinitely. "We'll need you available for depositions in the coming months," the congressional liaison added. "This is going to become a matter of public record, eventually, Mrs. Lawson, whether either of us would prefer that or not." "I understand," Maggie said, and did not mention that she had already begun quietly in the evenings after Noah went to bed, teaching herself to read the encrypted files on the drive Kane had handed her. Files that 3 nights into the effort had started to reveal names she recognized from briefings, decades-old names attached to positions of authority considerably higher than anything a mission church shootout would ever officially touch. She said nothing about any of it. Not yet. Some decisions she had learned a long time ago needed more than 4 days to make correctly. Life, in the strange, disorienting way that life insists on doing, even after the unthinkable happens, slowly began reassembling itself around its old shape. Noah went back to school 11 days after the kidnapping, Nervous and quiet the first morning, flinching at the sound of a slamming car door in the parking lot, and Maggie walked him all the way to the classroom door, despite his embarrassed protest standing there, until she watched him settle into his seat and manage finally a small, genuine smile at something a friend said. The garden neglected for nearly 2 weeks needed rescuing, tomato vines gone wild and tangled weeds threatening to choke out the rosemary. And Maggie spent an entire Saturday morning on her knees in the dirt, hands working soil instead of weapons, feeling something in her chest slowly, carefully begin to unclench, for the first time since 3:47 on that Tuesday afternoon, that felt now like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime. But some things didn't simply reassemble. She caught herself more than once checking the locks on doors she'd never once worried about in 11 years of living in that house. She found herself waking at odd hours, alert to sounds that turned out to be nothing, the house settling a coyote somewhere beyond the fence line, wind moving through the mesquite. And Noah, for his part, had started asking questions in the quiet moments between dinner and bedtime, questions that told her the 11-year-old boy who'd walked to Tyler's house that Tuesday afternoon no longer entirely existed either. "Did you kill people?" "Oh," he asked one evening apropos of nothing, looking up from a plate of spaghetti with an expression far too serious for his age. That night, at the ranch, Maggie set down her fork carefully, choosing her words with the same precision she'd once used choosing which wire to cut on a detonator. "Yes," she said, "I did." Noah absorbed this in silence for a long moment. "Were they bad people?" "They were doing something very bad," Maggie said. "They were helping keep you somewhere you didn't want to be hurting you. I stopped them the only way I could." "Do you feel bad about it?" It was, Maggie would think later, the single hardest question anyone had asked her in 30 years of a life built entirely around impossible questions, and she gave her grandson the only honest answer she had. "I feel like I would do it again every single time without hesitation to keep you safe," she said. "And I feel sad that the world sometimes makes that the only choice available to good people." Both of those things are true at once, Noah. You're going to learn as you get older that a lot of important truths work that way. Noah nodded slowly, chewing on this with the same careful gravity he brought to every genuinely important conversation. And then in the abrupt pivot, only children seemed capable of asked whether they could get a dog. And Maggie found herself laughing, a raw, real laugh, warm and unguarded for the first time in what felt like a very long while. 2 weeks after the debrief, Frank called. "You should see this," he said without preamble, the way he always opened conversations that mattered. "I've been quietly poking at something since you mentioned Kane's claim about corruption above Voss's level. I wasn't going to say anything, figured it was probably a desperate man's last manipulation. But Maggie, I found something." Maggie sat very still at her kitchen table, the same table where this entire nightmare had unfolded 30 days earlier, and felt her pulse quicken in a way she'd hoped foolishly might never happen again. "Tell me," she said. "There's a name buried 3 levels deep in agency personnel records. Someone who signed off on the original decision to classify the Zagros operation beyond standard protocol 14 years ago," Frank said. "That same name shows up again 6 years later on a financial disclosure form connected to an offshore account that never should have existed for someone at their security clearance level. And Maggie, that same person currently holds a seat on the exact oversight committee reviewing your case." The kitchen seemed to tilt slightly around her, the same vertiginous sensation she'd felt the moment Kane first spoke that name in the ruined Mission Church. "He wasn't lying," she said quietly. "I don't know that for certain," Frank said, "but I know enough to tell you that whatever's on that flash drive you never mentioned to Voss's team, Maggie, and don't bother denying you have it. I know you too well. It's worth taking a very hard, very careful look at before you decide this whole thing is actually finished." Maggie closed her eyes, feeling the weight of a decision she had been quietly avoiding for 2 full weeks finally settle onto her shoulders with undeniable, immovable force. Because Victor Kane was a monster. He had kidnapped her grandson, gotten 9 men killed, nearly killed her twice, and would spend whatever remained of his life in federal custody, paying for every bit of it exactly as he deserved. But somewhere above Director Voss, in an office with a nicer view, in a far more comfortable chair, someone had apparently spent 14 years protecting a secret that dangerous enough that a desperate, broken man had been willing to kidnap a child just to drag it back into the light. And Maggie found herself sitting alone in her quiet kitchen with the smell of rosemary drifting in through an open window, unable to simply let that stand, unexamined, whatever the personal cost of pursuing it might turn out to be. Frank, she said slowly, I think this isn't over after all. I was afraid you'd say that, Frank said, and something in his voice, weary, resigned, but unmistakably ready, told her he already knew exactly what she was about to ask of him. I need everything you can find, Maggie said, on that name, quietly, carefully. And Frank, this time we do it right. No compounds, no countdown clocks. No one else's child ever becomes leverage in this again. Understood, Frank said. Give me a week. Maggie hung up the phone and sat alone in her kitchen, a long while listening to the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening settling around her Noah's footsteps upstairs, water running as he brushed his teeth, the low hum of the refrigerator. All of it so achingly normal after everything the last month had cost them both. She thought of Kane broken and guarded in a federal medical facility, a man who had once told her that some truths didn't care whether the world was ready for them. She thought of Noah's small, brave face, asking whether she felt bad about the men she'd killed, and her own honest, complicated answer. She thought of a life she had built for 11 years specifically to bury the desert ghost so deep that even she sometimes forgot the woman had ever existed. That woman was not fully buried anymore. Maggie understood that now with a clarity that felt less like fear and more like simple, settled fact. Some part of her, the part that had walked through gunfire to reach a locked door, the part that had memorized fence rotations and blind spots without a single moment's hesitation, was awake now and intended to stay that way for as long as her grandson's safety, or the truth about what had really happened 14 years ago, required it. Upstairs, Noah called down that he was ready for his bedtime story, and Maggie rose from the table, tucked the thought of Frank's coming investigation into the same careful compartment where she kept everything else too dangerous to carry openly through daily life, and climbed the stairs toward her grandson's room, toward the ordinary precious ritual of a story and a goodnight kiss and a promise whispered every single night now that she would always, always come back. But even as she smoothed his blanket and switched off his lamp and pressed a kiss to his forehead, some quiet, watchful part of Margaret Lawson was already looking past tonight, past the fragile piece of the last 2 weeks toward whatever waited in the files Frank was about to start digging through toward a name on an oversight committee, an offshore account that should never have existed, and a truth that Victor Kane, for all his sins, had been telling her the whole time was still out there waiting. The desert had given her grandson back. It was not, she suspected, quite finished asking things of her yet. Frank called back in 5 days, not 7, and the moment Maggie heard his voice, she knew the news was heavier than either of them had expected. I found the account, he said. Offshore Cayman registered, opened 6 years ago under a shell name that traces back through 2 more shells before it lands on a real person. Maggie, the name is Deputy Director Harold Ashby. Maggie's hand tightened around the phone. She knew that name. Everyone in the intelligence community knew that name. Ashby sat 2 rungs above Voss, a career bureaucrat with 30 years of unblemished service, a man whose face had appeared in front of congressional committees a dozen times over the years, always composed, always trusted. You're certain, she said. As certain as I can be without a warrant, Frank said. And Maggie, there's more. I pulled flight records for the week the Zagros operation was buried 14 years ago. Ashby flew to Geneva 48 hours after your extraction. Same week the account was seeded with an initial deposit of $2.3 million. I don't have proof of what that money was for, but I have enough smoke that no honest investigator could look at it and call it a coincidence. Maggie sat in her kitchen, the phone pressed to her ear, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not vindication, but a kind of exhausted, sorrowful certainty. Kane had been telling the truth. Whatever else he was, whatever unforgivable things he had done, he had not lied about this. What do I do with this, Frank? She asked quietly. If I take it to Voss and Ashby has eyes inside her operation the way Kane claimed it disappears before it ever reaches a courtroom. If I take it public myself, I have no legal standing, no protection, and a very powerful man with a great deal to lose. There's a third option, Frank said slowly, and Maggie could hear him choosing his next words with unusual care. You go around both of them. There's a woman I trust, an inspector general with a reputation for actually finishing the investigations she starts no matter whose career gets in the way. She's outside Voss's chain of command, entirely reports directly to a congressional oversight board that even Ashby doesn't have leverage over, If you're going to hand this to anyone, Maggie, it should be her. Maggie closed her eyes, feeling the full weight of the decision settle over her one final time. Set it up, she said, quietly. The Inspector General's name was Diane Okafor, and she met Maggie not in a federal building, but in a public park in Phoenix, on a bench beneath a mesquite tree, dressed like any other woman enjoying a Saturday afternoon, a detail Maggie recognized immediately as deliberate, careful tradecraft, and respected her for it instantly. Frank speaks highly of you, Okafor said without preamble, eyes scanning the park with the same unhurried vigilance Maggie herself had once carried into every public meeting. He also tells me you're sitting on something that could end a very powerful man's career, and possibly a few others besides. I'm sitting on something that should have ended it 14 years ago, Maggie said, and handed her the flash drive wrapped now in a plain paper bag, passed between them with the practiced discretion of two people who had spent careers moving dangerous things without ever appearing to move anything at all. I need you to understand something before you take that. The man who originally obtained this material kidnapped my grandson. He is not a hero in this story, but the information itself doesn't lie just because the man who tried to weaponize it was a monster. Okafor studied her for a long moment, the flash drive resting in her open palm. You could have destroyed this, made your life simpler, made your grandson safer. My grandson isn't safe until men like Ashby stop believing they're untouchable, Maggie said. I learned a long time ago that burying the truth doesn't make anyone safer. It just changes who gets hurt by it and when. Something shifted in Okafor's expression, respect unmistakable, arriving slowly across a face trained for decades to reveal nothing at all. I'll need you to testify eventually. Sworn on the record, no protections, I can promise you in advance. I know, Maggie said. I've spent my whole life doing things without guarantees, Miss Okafor. I'm not going to start needing them now. Okafor closed her hand around the drive and rose from the bench. Then I'll be in touch. And Mrs. Lawson, for what it's worth, whatever happens from here, this took considerable courage. Most people given a clean exit take it. Most people don't have a grandson who asked them over spaghetti whether they felt bad about the people they killed to protect him, Maggie said. I owe him an answer that's actually true, all the way down, not just the parts that are convenient. Okafor walked away across the park, and Maggie sat alone on the bench a while longer, watching a group of children chase each other across a nearby playground, their laughter carrying bright and careless on the warm afternoon air, and let herself for just a moment imagine a version of the world where children like that never had to learn the things Noah had learned this past month. The investigation moved with the speed that surprised even Frank, who had warned Maggie repeatedly that these things typically crawled through bureaucracy for years before producing anything resembling justice. Within 3 weeks, Ashby was placed on administrative leave pending review of financial irregularities. Within 6, a grand jury had been quietly impaneled. Within 10, the story broke, not through any leak from Maggie's side, but through a congressional staffer who'd grown tired of watching the investigation stall in committee, and suddenly Harold Ashby's face was on every news channel. Maggie flipped past his composed public expression, replaced by the flat, hunted look of a man who had finally run out of rooms to hide in. Maggie watched the coverage once standing in her kitchen with a dish towel still in her hand and felt no satisfaction in it at all. Only a tired, hollow relief, the particular exhaustion of a fight finally truly ending. Noah wandered in halfway through the segment, glanced at the television and looked up at her with the sharp, searching expression he'd developed over the last 2 months, the expression of a boy who had learned to read the weather in his grandmother's face before she said a word. Is that because of what happened to us? He asked. Sort of, Maggie said, turning off the television. It's because some very bad men thought they could hide the truth forever and they were wrong. Did you have something to do with it? Maggie considered lying, considered the simpler, gentler version of the answer, and then remembered her own promise to herself that she owed this boy the truth all the way down. Yes, she said, I did. Noah nodded slowly, processing this the way he processed everything now, with a gravity far beyond his 11 years, and then in the way only he could manage, reached up and hugged her fiercely around the waist. Good, he said, muffled against her shirt. I'm glad you're my grandma and not somebody else's. Maggie laughed wet and unexpected and held him tight and thought that whatever else this entire impossible ordeal had cost either of them, it had not cost her this boy, this love, this fierce and simple certainty that she would always, always choose him, no matter what version of herself that choice required her to become. Kane's trial began in late autumn, held largely behind closed doors given the classified material involved, and Maggie testified twice once regarding the kidnapping and the compound once regarding the ledger and its contents. She sat across a courtroom from a man who had once told her she was the finest asset his agency had ever trained and watched him listen to her testimony with an expression that had somewhere in the intervening months lost every trace of the calculated calm he'd worn in that ruined mission church. During a recess in a hallway outside the courtroom, Kane's lawyer requested a brief, supervised conversation between the two of them, and against every instinct her old training screamed at her. Maggie agreed. Kane sat in a wheelchair, now still recovering fully from injuries the crash had left him with, and looked up at her with an expression she hadn't expected, not defiance, not manipulation, but something closer to genuine weary regret. "Ashby's investigation is moving because of you," he said quietly. "I know that. My lawyer tells me it might even factor favorably into sentencing that I provided material that led to exposing a genuinely corrupt official." "It won't erase what you did to my grandson," Maggie said. "No," Kane agreed. "Nothing will. I know that." He was quiet a moment, studying her with something like the ghost of the mentor he had once been decades ago in briefing rooms that no longer existed. "For what it's worth, Margaret and I understand. If it's worth nothing at all to you, I am sorry. Not for exposing Ashby, not for wanting the truth out, but for believing even for a moment that hurting your family was an acceptable price to pay for it. That was never justice. That was just my own bitterness wearing justice's face." Maggie studied him a long moment, this broken-aged man who had once been brilliant, once been trusted, once been someone she genuinely admired before betrayal reshaped him into someone else entirely. "I hope you find whatever peace is left for you, Victor," she said finally. "But I'm not going to pretend that sorry undoes 11 hours of my grandson sitting bound on a dirt floor, terrified he'd never see me again. Some debts don't get forgiven just because the debtor finally understands what he owes." She turned and walked back into the courtroom and did not look back, because looking back in this life or any other had never once been something she could afford. Kane was convicted on all major counts 3 weeks later, kidnapping, treason, conspiracy, accessory to multiple murders, and sentenced to the remainder of his natural life in federal custody. Ashby's trial, delayed and complicated by the sheer scope of the financial evidence involved, was still unfolding a year later. But the outcome, by every account Frank passed along, seemed no longer to be a question of if, only when. Spring came to Tucson the way it always did, sudden and generous, after a long gray winter, wildflowers blooming across the desert floor, in colors that seemed almost defiant against the harsh landscape that produced them. And Maggie stood in her garden one Saturday morning, hands deep in soil, watching Noah chase a lizard across the yard with the pure and complicated joy of a boy who had, against every terrible odds stacked against him, nearly a year earlier, found his way back to being simply a child again. He was 12 now, taller, his voice beginning the first cracked hints of the deeper register it would eventually settle into, and though something in his eyes had changed permanently that Tuesday afternoon a year ago, a wariness, a watchfulness, that Maggie doubted would ever fully disappear. The boy chasing a lizard across her backyard, laughing, utterly present in the ordinary joy of the moment, told her everything she needed to know about how thoroughly they had both in their own ways survived. "Grandma," he called, holding the lizard up triumphantly before releasing it back into the rosemary bushes. "Did you see that I almost had him?" "I saw," Maggie said, smiling, wiping dirt from her hands onto her jeans. "Nearly." He wandered over and dropped down beside her in the dirt, unbothered by getting his knees filthy, and together they worked in comfortable silence for a while, pulling weeds from around the tomato plants that had, after a full year of neglect and recovery, finally begun producing fruit again. Small green, promising exactly the way they always had before any of this began. "Grandma," Noah said, eventually not looking up from the weed he was pulling. "Do you ever miss it, being a spy, I mean, before you had me?" Maggie considered the question seriously, the way she considered every question this boy asked her, now weighing it with the same care she'd once given operational briefings that determined whether people lived or died. "Sometimes," she admitted, "there's a part of that life that made me feel sharp and necessary and useful in a way that's hard to explain. I won't pretend I don't still feel echoes of that every now and then." "But," Noah prompted, sensing correctly that a bigger truth was still coming. "But nothing I ever did in that life," Maggie said. "Not one operation, not one mission, not one secret I ever kept, None of it ever mattered to me the way one single ordinary Tuesday afternoon with you matters. Helping with your homework, watching you chase lizards, burning cookies because I got distracted watching you learn to ride a bike. She reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind his ear, the same gesture she'd made 1,000 times over the years, grounding and familiar. I spent 24 years being someone the world needed in secret. I've spent 12 years being someone you need out loud in the open every single day. That second thing turned out to be the better life, Noah, by a very wide margin. Noah smiled a real smile, unguarded and easy, and leaned his head briefly against her shoulder before returning to his weeding. And Maggie sat there in the warm spring sun, hands in the dirt, listening to the ordinary sounds of an ordinary Saturday morning birds somewhere in the mesquite, a distant lawnmower, her grandson humming some half-remembered tune under his breath, and felt for the first time in longer than she could easily measure that the war was truly finally over. The desert ghost had not disappeared. Maggie understood it in a way she hadn't fully accepted during those 11 quiet years, before Kane's phone call tore her ordinary life apart. That woman, trained lethal, unyielding, would always exist somewhere beneath the surface, coiled and ready, exactly as ready as she had been the night she cut through a chain-link fence to reach a locked-out building door. But she had learned something in the year since, something that mattered more than any operational lesson 24 years of fieldwork had ever taught her: that the ghost and the grandmother were never actually two separate women fighting for control of the same body. They were the same woman, always had been, wearing whatever face the moment required, soft enough to bake cookies and read bedtime stories on ordinary Tuesdays, and sharp enough when the world demanded it to walk alone into gunfire and bring her grandson home. That she understood now, sitting in her garden with dirt under her fingernails and her grandson's shoulder warm against her own, had never been a contradiction at all. It had simply been love, wearing whatever armor love required. Somewhere out beyond the fence line, the desert stretched on toward the mountains, vast and unchanged, holding its silence the way it always had, keeping its secrets the way it always would. It had tested her once, tried to take everything that mattered from her in a single terrible night, and she had walked through its fire and come out the other side with her grandson safe in her arms and her family still whole. The desert did not forgive mistakes, but it remembered its own. And Margaret Lawson, grandmother, gardener, ghost, was and would always remain one of its own for as long as she drew breath to protect the people she loved.